Happy Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and friends of Baylor. Well, I had my sister over this last weekend and I spent 3 days cooking. And turns out presentation is everything because Lily is acting out and now I have to present the food in just the right way. But anyway, my therapist says I'll be getting over my sister in about another, 10 or 15 years, as long as I keep up my monthly treatments. But anyways, a wonderful visit. Happy to see you, Jan. I can't wait till you come next year. Anyway, lots of things happening. Sort of good news in the COVID world. COVID numbers are getting better worldwide. Numbers are down by a pretty significant amount, almost 20% worldwide. In U.S. and Europe, we were the leaders in this last BA4 and BA5 surge, but we're both coming down now. So both U.S. and Europe are coming down. In U.S., cases have fallen by about 15%. We're still at about 100,000 cases a day. The good news is because we can't follow case numbers very well, everyone's testing at home, but hospitalizations are a good indicator, and they are falling by last week by 3%. And as a result, the CDC, God bless them, I can't figure out what they're thinking, but the CDC has decided to loosen its guidelines. They're a little bit behind the times. What are you going to do? Interestingly enough, deaths, they're always a lagging indicator. Deaths have not begun to fall yet, but I anticipate that they will. So if you look at the U.S., it looks pretty good. Cases have plateaued. This is the CDC data. And if you look at deaths in the United States, are beginning to plateau as well. The good news is that new admissions are falling, as I mentioned, almost by 12%. This is really interesting. And you see the admissions, mostly it's in the age group of 70 and older. So, this has been a change in the dynamics of the pandemic, but, if you're over the age of 70, God bless you, those are the high-risk people. And, I've gotten a lot of calls from people and emails asking, is it still mostly in unvaccinated? Well, the recent data are that you're still 6 times more likely to die from COVID if you're unvaccinated. So it's not, it's still, being vaccinated is really important. So I wish people would finally get vaccinated. The BA4 and 5 mutants, BA5 being the dominant one, they now account for 94% of all the viruses in the country. And I'm going to show you some really interesting data about the way that the dynamics of the waves in just a second. But first, in Texas, our friends in Dimmitt County, God love them, they're now low in the community. 118 cases, down from 168 per 100,000. That's but the CDC says below 200 is good, and below 10 admissions, they're at 9.9. So they're a low spreading community. Harris County, where Houston is, we're still high, but coming down. We're down to 211 from 234 cases per 100,000 last week, and 17 admissions. So we're coming down, but not, we're still a high-risk community. Here in the TMC, we're collecting data individually, and you can see our testing numbers are going down. We're down to about 11.8% of our tests being positive. And the good news is hospitalizations are finally really coming down. You can see that very nicely here. Hospitalizations are coming down. And the wastewater, which is probably our best predictor of what's to come, is really falling. You can see we peaked from Omicron, the BA4 peak, and it's coming back down. Now, I mentioned it's really fascinating to me to watch the waves of these mutations. And this is a really good depiction of that. You can see early on in the pandemic, the waves of mutations were coming very quickly. So a few months for Alpha and Gamma, then Delta was about a 7th month before it was replaced with Omicron. Omicron's now been here for about 9 months. And so I think there's some positive news in that. Early on, all these mutations were replacing each of the previous variants, but there's only so many mutations that can happen and have the virus still fit. And I think what we're seeing is it's slowing down in terms of the ability to have new mutations that are more fit than the previous ones. And this might account for why we're seeing a worldwide trend down, as well as the USA, is we still have had Omicron around, and people are either being infected by it, and getting more resistance, or we have more and more people finally being, in our community, being resistant to this Omicron variant. So interesting news from Britain became the first country to authorize the Moderna vaccine, the bivalent Moderna vaccine. Half of it's going to target the original variant that was isolated in Wuhan, and the other half will be towards the most recent Omicron, BA4 and BA5. And their clinical trials showed that there was a good immune response to both of the variants in this bivalent vaccine. I'll probably talk about the data for that coming up. Those trials are ongoing in the United States, but it's really interesting to see whether or not we can get a bivalent vaccine and eventually a multivalent, even maybe trivalent or quadrivalent vaccine. Now, of course, the CDC has been pretty opaque through this whole thing. I mean, I hate to be critical, but they sort of missed the beginning of the testing. They did that incorrectly. It was very difficult to get information. Even when we had tests, we had to send it to Atlanta. It took a long time to get back. Never really mobilized the academic community quite in the way that was needed, and we all filled in for that. And they have now changed their recommendations again. I think to a certain extent they've capitulated. I mean, the country has moved on, and the CDC is a little bit behind them. But right now, what they're saying, the latest recommendations for K-12 schools as we approach the new school year, is that pretty much standard stuff. Stay up to date on your vaccinations. If you're sick, stay home. Be sure to optimize ventilation. Be sure to wash your hands, clean surfaces. That's kind of standard. But what they're saying, if you're in a high-level community, Harris County is right now, that you should still have universal masking. They recommend that, even though many people don't. We do at Baylor College of Medicine. When you're wearing a mask, make sure it's well-fitting. The biggest change has been that if you're exposed, we're no longer quarantining people. They're no longer recommending quarantine, but simply wearing a mask for the 10 days. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings about that. If you know you're COVID positive, my feeling is stay home for 4 or 5 days. But the CDC says no longer quarantine if you're exposed. So if you have it, you should stay home. They also changed their recommendation for testing, which is they no longer recommend routine testing in K through 12. But if someone has symptoms, they suggest that you do get tested. And the big difference is, as I said, if you're exposed, they're no longer expecting you to quarantine. If you actually have it, you should stay home. A little bit update on monkeypox. Monkeypox continues to be a problem in the country. We're up to 11,000, almost 12,000 cases. You can see in a number of different states. Here in Texas, the largest number of cases remain in Dallas, and Houston has got 315 cases. And for the first time, we actually have a child that got infected, a 2-year-old child. The trends in the U.S. are upward. You can see continuing to increase. But it looks like in our community, the numbers are beginning to fall. So you can see the monkeypox numbers are coming back down. The city of Houston has expanded its monkeypox eligibility for pretty much anybody living with HIV. And they're expected to receive more vaccine. We were supposed to get more, but actually we didn't. Hopefully we'll get more. But remember, the threat in the community is very, very low, unless you're in a high-risk group. But it's still very, very low. And, of course, leave it to the French. First possible case of human-to-dog transmission of monkeypox. Lily brought this to my attention. She was very upset by this. A friend of hers was a 4-year-old Italian greyhound, started showing symptoms after being exposed to their owner. And 12 days later, and the dog developed lesions. They sequenced it was the same exact monkeypox as the monkeypox that the owner had. Now, it's not clear whether dogs can transmit to humans, but we now know that humans can transmit to dogs. I'm not going to go there. We're not going to even talk about that. So last week, there's always something in the news. Last week it was polio. But this week, our good friend, Linfa Wang at Duke, I've talked about him many times in Singapore, he started a surveillance study over the past 3 years in eastern provinces of China. And it enrolled 35 patients that had fever in the last 3 years. And they found a 53-year-old woman who had a particular type of virus, a new Henipavirus, they call it LayV, which is named after the town Langia, where it was found in Shandong province. And it doesn't look like it transmits between people, but they found 35 people who were infected with this, and it was mostly farmers who had symptoms. And it turns out they've been looking at various animals, and the animals that they found that had most of this virus was the weasel. So this is a good example of why we need to have constant surveillance of the animal population as well as humans. And this is the most important thing, because these kinds of zoonoses that spills out all the time. So we have to have really good surveillance programs. We don't, honestly, we don't do enough surveillance. And that's one of the important things I think that we've learned from this pandemic. Well, I want to end today with a bunch of shout-outs. First of all, just in time for the flu season, the FDA has approved Xofluza to treat uncomplicated influenza in children age 5 to 12. So this is the first single-dose oral influenza medication for children in this age range. So that's really great. Big shout-out to Tony Piedra, one of our professors of microbiology, who is one of the study investigators. This is really important. We haven't been able to treat in that group, so that's really good. Another big shout-out to Pamela Fitzsimmons-Howard, who has given me a subscription to the Carrizo Springs Haviland newspaper. Because of my passion for Dimmitt County, you can see that even in the title of the newspaper, you can see a Haviland. And of course, one last shout out to Mike Stevens in our facility group, because Mike finally removed the dead tree that my sister's been complaining about in the courtyard. So anyway, have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see you next week.